On a cold November afternoon in 2019, at the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, three men made a decision that would alter the trajectories of their lives in ways they could never have imagined. Maria Calabrese, a 42-year-old woman dressed in black, knelt before her husband's fresh grave, weeping quietly as she placed white roses on the dark earth that had swallowed the man she'd loved for 20 years. Vincent Calabrese had died suddenly of a heart attack at 45, leaving Maria alone to navigate a world that suddenly felt impossibly vast and empty. The cemetery was nearly deserted in the late afternoon gloom, most visitors having departed before the winter darkness descended. Maria had lingered, unable to tear herself away from this place where all that remained of Vincent now rested. She was so absorbed in her grief, so lost in memories of the life they'd built together, that she didn't notice the three men approaching until they were almost upon her. They were young, probably in their mid-20s, with the hungry look of predators who'd spotted easy prey. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, grabbed Maria's purse from where it sat beside her on the ground. When she instinctively reached for it, crying out in shock and protest, one of the others shoved her hard, sending her sprawling across Vincent's grave. They laughed as they rifled through her belongings, taking her wallet, her phone, even the small gold locket that contained Vincent's photograph. What these men didn't know, what they couldn't have known from looking at this ordinary grieving woman, was that Maria's maiden name was Torino. She was the younger sister of Michael Torino, known in certain circles as Mickey the Blade, underboss of the Lucchese crime family, and one of the most feared men in organized crime on the East Coast. Vincent had been a legitimate businessman, deliberately kept separate from Maria's family connections, and she had built a life far removed from the world her brother inhabited. But blood, as they say, is thicker than water, and what those three men had just done would bring down upon them a reckoning that the criminal underworld would speak of in hushed tones for years to come. I had been sitting in my office in Midtown Manhattan when my phone rang with a call I'd been dreading in some form for years, though not for the reason it came. My sister, Maria's voice on the other end, was shaking, barely coherent through tears that were equal parts grief and rage. She told me what had happened at Vincent's grave, how three animals had attacked her while she mourned, how they'd stolen from her and put their hands on her, violating the sacred ground where her husband lay. I felt something cold and familiar settle into my chest as I listened, that particular calm that comes over me when violence becomes not just an option, but an inevitability. I told Maria to go home, to lock her doors, and to wait for me. Then I made a series of calls to people who owed me favors, or feared me enough that favors were irrelevant. Within 2 hours, I had names, addresses, and backgrounds on the three men who had made the catastrophic error of touching my sister. They were small-time criminals, street-level thugs who robbed graves and mugged mourners because they were too stupid or too desperate to do anything requiring actual skill. Their names were Derek Morrison, Jason Cole, and a kid they called Tiny, who was anything but, real name Timothy Dawson. None of them had any idea they'd just declared war on an organization that had been perfecting the art of retribution for over a century. My name is Michael Torino, and I've been part of this life since I was 15 years old, almost 40 years ago now. I started as a runner for my uncle Angelo, delivering packages and messages that I knew better than to open or question. By 20, I'd made my bones, a euphemism for killing someone to prove your loyalty and capability to the family. By 30, I was a capo with my own crew. Now, at 54, I'm underboss of the Lucchese family, second in command to a boss who mostly handles political connections and legitimate business fronts, while I manage the operations that actually generate revenue and maintain our territorial control. I've done things I'm not proud of, and things I sleep perfectly well after doing. I've hurt people who deserved it, and people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I've always operated by certain codes, certain lines that even men like me don't cross. You don't hurt women. You don't hurt children. And you sure as hell don't put your hands on someone's grieving widow at her husband's grave. These three had violated rules so fundamental that even other criminals would understand what had to happen next. I drove to Maria's apartment in Bay Ridge that evening, bringing with me my most trusted associate, a man named Paulie Romano, who'd been with me for 23 years. Paulie was 51, built like a boxer which he'd been in his youth, and he had the useful quality of being utterly calm in situations that made other men panic. When we arrived, Maria had composed herself somewhat, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, still wearing the black dress from the cemetery. She looked small and fragile in a way I hadn't seen since we were children, and something protective and ancient stirred in me. She was my baby sister, 5 years younger, and I'd spent my whole life making sure the ugliness of what I did never touched her. She'd married Vincent precisely because he was clean, a man who owned a small chain of dry cleaners and had never committed a crime more serious than parking violations. She'd built a life that was normal, safe, far removed from the world of violence and moral compromise that had shaped me. And now, these three pieces of trash had dragged that violence right into her sanctuary of grief. I sat across from her and took her hands in mine, hands that I'd used to strangle men and break bones but that were gentle now with my sister, and I told her something I meant with every fibre of my being. I would make this right. She would have justice, or something that looked enough like it that she could sleep at night. Finding the three men was almost insultingly easy, which told me everything I needed to know about their intelligence and survival instincts. They lived in a run-down apartment building in East New York, one of those places where nobody asks questions and everyone minds their own business because curiosity can be fatal. I had my people watch the building for 2 days, documenting their routines, who visited when they came and went. They were creatures of habit in the way that stupid people often are. Creatures who'd never had to think strategically about their movements because they'd never encountered consequences serious enough to teach them caution. Derek Morrison, the leader with the scar, seemed to be the one with minimal brain cells among them. He at least varied his routes sometimes and occasionally looked over his shoulder. Jason Cole and Tiny were followers, men who did what Derek told them and never thought beyond their next meal or drink. They'd already spent some of Maria's money on cheap liquor and keeper women, celebrating their score like it was some great heist instead of the pathetic robbery of a grieving woman. Watching them through surveillance photos, I felt not anger exactly, but something colder. The absolute certainty that these men had used up whatever right to existence they'd ever had. On the third night after the incident at the cemetery, I decided it was time to collect what was owed. I assembled a crew of 6 men, all trusted soldiers, who'd proven themselves in situations requiring discretion and efficiency. We arrived at the apartment building at 3 a.m, that dead hour when even criminals are usually asleep and the streets are emptiest. 2 of my men stayed with the vehicles, while the other 4 came with me up the poorly lit stairwell to the 4th-floor apartment, where our targets slept off their latest drinking binge. The lock on their door was a joke, the kind of thing a child could pick, and we were inside within 30 seconds without making a sound that would alert anyone. The apartment was exactly what I'd expected. Filthy, littered with empty bottles and fast food containers, smelling of stale beer and unwashed bodies. It was the habitat of men who'd given up on dignity long before they'd given up on crime. We moved through the space quickly and professionally. Paulie and another man named Frankie took Derek from his bedroom, handcuffing him before he fully woke. 2 others grabbed Jason from the couch where he'd passed out. I personally went for Tiny, who was sleeping in what might have been a closet converted into a bedroom, and I felt a moment of something almost like pity when I saw him, just a kid really, maybe 23, who'd probably never had a chance to be anything but what he was. We transported them to a warehouse in Red Hook that the family owned through a series of shell corporations, one of several properties we maintained for situations requiring privacy and soundproofing. The building had been a seafood processing plant decades ago, but now sat mostly empty, except for occasions like this, when it served its true purpose. By the time we arrived and got them inside, all three were fully awake and beginning to understand that they were in a situation they wouldn't escape from. I could see the progression of realization on their faces, the movement from confusion to fear to desperate mental searching for some explanation that wasn't the obvious one. Derek tried to maintain some swagger at first, demanding to know who we were and what we wanted, using language that suggested he'd watched too many movies about criminals and thought he understood how this world worked. I let him talk himself out while my men secured them to chairs bolted to the floor, arranging them in a line facing me where I stood about 10 feet away. The warehouse was cold despite industrial heaters we'd brought in, and their breath made small clouds in the air. There was a quality to the silence in that space, a weight that came from the knowledge of what had happened in places like this before and what was about to happen again. I've found that fear is most useful when it's given time to grow, when the imagination is allowed to work before reality arrives. So I let them sit there for 20 minutes, just looking at them, saying nothing while my men stood at various positions around the warehouse's interior. I watched Derek's bravado crumble minute by minute, watched Jason start to cry quietly, watched Tiny shake so hard the chair he was bound to rattled against the concrete floor. Finally, when I judged they'd marinated in terror sufficiently, I walked forward until I was standing directly in front of Derek. I asked him if he knew why he was here. He stammered something about not knowing what I was talking about, playing dumb in that way that criminals always do when caught, as if denying reality will somehow alter it. I backhanded him across the face, not particularly hard, but enough to snap his head to the side and split his lip. Then I told him exactly why they were here, describing in detail what they'd done to my sister at the cemetery 4 days ago. I watched comprehension dawn on his face, that terrible moment when you realize the scope of your mistake. He started begging immediately, words tumbling over each other, saying he didn't know, they didn't mean anything, it was just a robbery, nobody was supposed to get hurt. Each excuse was more pathetic than the last. I let him finish his pleading before I explained something to all three of them, something I wanted them to understand completely in whatever time they had left. I told them about Maria, about how she'd spent 20 years building a clean life, about Vincent and how his death had shattered her, about how the cemetery was supposed to be a place where she could grieve in peace. I told them about the rules that govern even a world as violent as mine, rules that exist because without some boundaries, we're just animals tearing at each other, with no purpose beyond immediate gratification. I told them that they'd violated something sacred, and while I didn't expect them to understand the theology of it, they needed to understand that consequences were absolute and unavoidable. Jason was sobbing openly now, snot running down his face, begging for another chance, promising anything. Tiny had gone silent, perhaps understanding that nothing he said would matter. Derek was still trying to find an angle, asking what he could do to make this right, offering to return what they'd stolen, offering to work for me, offering anything his desperate mind could conceive. I felt nothing for any of them. They'd used up my mercy when they put their hands on my sister. What happened next was methodical and necessary. I'm not going to detail the specifics, because some things don't need to be recorded, even in testimony or story. Some things are better left in the warehouses and basements where they occur, known only to those who were present. What I will say is that justice of a sort was administered, that Maria's violation was answered with the kind of response that sends a message through the community. When it was done, 3 men who'd woken up that morning in their filthy apartment no longer existed in any meaningful way. Their bodies were disposed of using methods that have been refined over decades to ensure they'd never be found, never be identified, never give closure to whatever family members might wonder where they'd gone. They simply vanished from the world as if they'd never existed, which in a cosmic sense was perhaps more mercy than they deserved. I'd given them the chance to understand why this was happening, which was more than they'd given Maria when they attacked her. By dawn, we'd cleaned the warehouse thoroughly, removing any trace that 3 men had died there. my crew dispersed to various locations with instructions to maintain their normal routines, to give no indication that anything unusual had occurred. And I drove home to my apartment in Little Italy as the sun was rising over the city, feeling that particular exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from the expenditure of emotional and moral energy. I didn't sleep that morning despite my exhaustion. Instead, I sat in my living room with a glass of expensive scotch, looking out at the city and thinking about the choices that define a life. I'd become what I was through a combination of circumstance, family legacy, and decisions made when I was too young to fully understand their implications. By the time I'd realized what path I was on, I was already too far down it to turn back. You can't unring bells, can't unkill people, can't wash certain stains from your soul no matter how much you might want to. I'd long ago made peace with who I was and what I did, accepting that I was a monster of a particular type, a monster that served certain functions in the ecosystem of human civilization. I kept order in communities where the law was irrelevant. I provided services that people needed but society couldn't legally supply. I resolved disputes through violence so that violence didn't spiral into chaos. It was rationalization, of course, the kind of moral architecture that allows men like me to look at themselves in mirrors. But it was also not entirely untrue. The world is messier than the law accounts for, and sometimes the spaces between legal and illegal are where real life actually happens. Still, sitting there in the dawn light, I wondered what different choices might have led to different outcomes, if there was a version of me that could have existed outside this life of controlled brutality. I went to see Maria the next afternoon, bringing with me something I'd retrieved from the personal effects of the three men before their disposal. Her gold locket, the one with Vincent's photograph, had been in Derek's jacket pocket. I'd had it cleaned and polished, so there was no trace of the hands that had stolen it. When I gave it to Maria in her kitchen, the same place where I'd promised her justice 4 days earlier, she broke down completely in a way she hadn't even at Vincent's funeral. She cried for everything lost, for Vincent, and for whatever innocence she'd maintained about the world's capacity for casual cruelty, and for whatever she understood, without asking about how her locket had been returned to her. I held her while she cried, this woman who was my sister and my responsibility, and one of the few things in my life that was entirely good and uncomplicated. She didn't ask what I'd done, and I didn't offer details. There was an understanding between us that had developed over decades, a recognition that there were parts of my life she didn't want to know about, and parts of her grief I couldn't fully understand. But we were family, bound by blood and history, and that meant something more fundamental than morality or law. When she finally composed herself, she thanked me in a way that told me she knew approximately what thanking me meant. I told her it was handled, that she'd never be bothered by those men again, that she could visit Vincent's grave in peace and safety. She nodded, accepting this, and we sat together in silence drinking tea while winter afternoon light filtered through her kitchen window. The disappearance of Derek Morrison, Jason Cole, and Timothy Dawson created exactly the amount of attention I'd expected, which is to say, almost none. Men like that vanish from the streets of New York constantly, swallowed by violence or misadventure or simple decisions to leave town and start over somewhere else. There were no family members who pushed for serious investigation, no friends who cared enough to raise sustained alarm. The police filed missing persons reports that went into databases where they'd sit indefinitely unless bodies turned up, which they wouldn't. A detective who worked in that precinct and who owed favors to our family made sure the investigation never gained any momentum, that it remained low priority. Just 3 more lowlifes who'd probably OD'd somewhere or gotten crossways with other criminals. Within a month, the case was effectively closed without ever being officially closed, filed away in that vast category of urban mysteries that no one solves because no one really tries. Life moved on. Maria continued grieving for Vincent in the way that widows do, the sharp pain eventually dulling into permanent ache, learning to carry loss like a weight she'd bear forever, but could eventually function under. She returned to work at the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade, surrounded herself with friends and family, and slowly reconstructed meaning in a world that Vincent no longer inhabited. She never mentioned the incident at the cemetery again, and neither did I. But within the world I operated in, the response to what had happened became something of a legend, the kind of story that gets told in social clubs and at weddings, usually in hushed tones and never with my name directly attached. The narrative that circulated was that 3 idiots had attacked a made man's sister and had been erased from existence with a thoroughness that was almost artistic. Details were exaggerated in the retelling, as details always are, but the core message was clear, and was intended to be clear. Certain lines remained inviolable no matter how much the world changed. Certain old-school values persisted even as the mob itself evolved and adapted to new realities of law enforcement and changing economics. You protected family. You responded to insults with overwhelming force. You demonstrated that actions had consequences that were proportional not to law, but to honor, that archaic concept that still governed men like me even in the 21st century. Younger guys in the family looked at me with something like awe after the story circulated, which was both gratifying and somewhat disturbing given what that awe was based on. Older guys, men who'd been in this life as long as I had, nodded approvingly when they saw me, recognition of a thing done correctly passing between us without words. I'm 54 years old now, and I've been thinking more about legacy, about what I'll leave behind when I'm gone, which will probably be sooner rather than later, given how I've lived and the enemies I've accumulated. I have no children, never married, devoted my life to the family in a way that precluded normal family. Maria is my closest living relative, the one person whose opinion of me actually matters. Sometimes I wonder what she really thinks, whether she sees me as protector or monster or some complicated combination of both. I know she loves me because we're bound by childhood and blood, but I also suspect she's afraid of me, or perhaps afraid of what I'm capable of, which isn't quite the same thing. That afternoon at the cemetery, those 3 men gave me a chance to be what I've always tried to be for her, the brother who keeps the darkness away, who ensures that her world remains safe, even if the cost of that safety is paid in currencies she'd rather not think about. Whether I succeeded in that, whether the violence I committed in her name was gift or burden, is something I'll probably never know for certain. She wears the gold locket every day, Vincent's photograph pressed against her heart, and she visits his grave regularly without incident. For now, that's enough. The criminal world I operate in has changed dramatically over the 4 decades I've been part of it. When I started, the 5 families still had genuine power in New York, controlled unions and construction and garbage collection, were forces that politicians and businessmen had to negotiate with. Now, after RICO prosecutions and waves of informants and changing economics, we're shadows of what we were. The young guys coming up don't have the discipline or the patience that my generation had, don't understand the importance of codes and structures that govern our world. They want money fast, don't care about reputation or respect, and they talk too much to too many people. The feds have gotten smarter too, using electronic surveillance that makes the old ways of communicating dangerous, infiltrating organizations with undercover agents and flipped members. I've watched the empire crumble slowly over decades, seen friends go to prison for life, seen others turn rat and enter witness protection, seen the families reduced from powerful syndicates to something closer to street gangs with better suits. But some things persist. The need for justice outside the law, the bonds of blood family, the understanding that some violations require responses that courts and cops can't provide. That's why what happened to those 3 men at the cemetery still matters, still resonates. It's a reminder that beneath all the changes, beneath the RICO acts and the surveillance and the informants, there's still a core of something that the law can't reach or eliminate, something primal about loyalty and revenge, and the lengths people will go to protect those they love. I think about my sister often, about the life she built that was so different from mine, about how one family can produce such divergent paths. We grew up in the same house, had the same parents, experienced the same neighborhood, but I was the boy, the one expected to follow my uncle into the life, to carry on traditions that stretched back to Sicily and the old country. Maria was the girl, protected and sheltered, given opportunities to escape that I was never offered. She took those opportunities, made something clean and good, and I'm proud of her for that in ways I've never been able to articulate. When our parents died, first our father from cancer and then our mother from heartbreak a year later, it was Maria who arranged the funerals, who dealt with the practical aspects of death and grief, who held the family together in legitimate ways, while I held it together through violence and threat. We're two sides of the same coin, two responses to the same heritage. She chose law and light. I chose something that operates in perpetual shadow. But we're still family, still bound by something stronger than the choices that differentiated us. And when she needed me, when those three men violated her in that cemetery, I was there the way I've always been there, the way I always will be, until I'm too old or too dead to fulfill that role. The warehouse in Red Hook was sold 6 months after the incident, part of a general liquidation of assets, as the family prepared for what we all knew was coming. Indictments, arrests, the final chapter of what had been. I made sure it was thoroughly cleaned before the sale, that nothing remained that could tie any of us to anything that had occurred there over the years. Buildings hold memories and secrets, and that warehouse held plenty of both, but they'd leave with us rather than remaining in the concrete and steel. I drove by it one last time before the sale was finalized, sitting in my car across the street, looking at the weathered facade and thinking about all the moments of violence and justice and revenge that those walls had contained. It was just a building, just a space, but it represented something about my life and my choices. It was where theory became practice, where threats became reality, where men learned that actions have consequences that transcend law. Part of me was relieved to let it go, to close that chapter, but another part recognized that as long as I was alive, as long as I remained what I was, there would always be another warehouse, another space where necessary things occurred, away from light and witnesses. You can't leave this life, not really. You can retire from active operations, you can step back from daily business, but the instincts and the worldview remain. I'll always be the man who knows how to make problems disappear, who understands violence as a language and a tool, who can look at a situation and see solutions that other people's morality prevents them from considering. Maria called me 2 years after Vincent's death to tell me she was selling the house they'd bought together, moving to a smaller apartment, starting over in the way that widows eventually must. She sounded stronger than she had in months, like she'd finally moved from simply surviving grief to actually living beyond it. She thanked me again, not specifically for anything, but in a way that we both understood, for being her brother, for protecting her, for making it possible for her to visit Vincent without fear. I told her I'd always be there, which was both promise and warning. Acknowledgement that I'd do anything for her, but also that my protection came with costs and complications. We met for dinner that week at a restaurant in Little Italy, one of the old school places that still made pasta the way our grandmother had taught them, and we talked about family and memory and the different ways people navigate loss. She told me about her students, about lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences, and the small dramas of elementary school that seemed so distant from my world. I told her carefully edited stories about my life, business dealings described in vague terms, associates mentioned only by nicknames, nothing that would burden her with specific knowledge. We were performing an elaborate dance we'd perfected over decades, siblings who loved each other but inhabited such different realities that complete honesty was impossible. I'm writing this now because I know how stories get told and retold in my world, how truth becomes legend, becomes myth. The cemetery incident has already been distorted beyond recognition, in some tellings, transformed into something more dramatic, or more brutal, or more righteous than what actually happened. I want there to be at least one version that's accurate, that acknowledges the complexity and the cost. Yes, I avenged my sister. Yes, justice of a sort was served. But justice in this context meant 3 men dead, murdered in ways that haunt me still in quiet moments, eliminated because they violated codes that most of the world doesn't recognize or care about. I don't regret what I did because the alternative was accepting their violation of Maria, and that was never a possibility I could live with. But I also don't celebrate it or take pride in it the way younger guys in the family seem to when they talk about it. It was necessary. It was inevitable given who I am and what those men did, but it was also a tragedy of a particular kind. 4 lives ended or were irrevocably changed that week. 3 through death and mine, through the accumulation of one more act of violence onto a conscience already heavy with them. This is what it means to live in my world, to be the kind of man who resolves problems through force, to be protector and destroyer simultaneously. You can't separate the roles or claim only the honourable parts. You're the whole package, or you're nothing. The locket Maria wears daily is a reminder to both of us of what happened, though we never speak of it directly. Sometimes I see her touch it absently, fingers finding the familiar metal, and I wonder if she's thinking of Vincent or of what her brother did to retrieve it for her. The boundary between love and violence in families like ours is thinner than most people can understand, and maybe that's for the best. Most people shouldn't have to understand the calculations that go into decisions like the one I made that November. They shouldn't have to weigh revenge against risk, justice against law, loyalty against morality. They should be able to live in a world where attacking a widow at a cemetery results in arrest and trial and prison through legitimate channels, where brothers don't have to become executioners, where protection doesn't require killing. But that's not the world I live in, not the world Maria lives in, despite her best efforts to escape it. We're products of a particular culture and history, shaped by Sicily and New York, and organised crime, by codes that predate modern law, and that will probably survive it too. What happened to those 3 men was inevitable from the moment they touched my sister. They just didn't know it yet. By the time they figured it out, strapped to chairs in a warehouse in Red Hook, it was far too late. Some mistakes you don't get to learn from. Some consequences are final and absolute. That's the lesson, if there is one, in this whole ugly story. I visit Vincent's grave sometimes, usually when I know Maria won't be there, because my presence would raise questions we're both happier leaving unasked. I stand where those 3 men stood, looking at the headstone that marks the end of a good man's life, and I think about the randomness of violence and the chains of causation that connect seemingly unrelated events. Vincent died of a heart attack, natural causes, nothing to do with me or my world. But his death created the circumstances that led to Maria being at the cemetery alone, which led to the robbery, which led to 3 men dying in ways that were anything but natural. There's no cosmic justice in any of this. No sense that Vincent's death was balanced by the deaths of his widow's attackers. There's just the grinding machinery of cause and effect, action and reaction, the fundamental truth that violence begets violence until someone decides to stop or everyone involved is dead. I've been part of that machinery for 4 decades, and I'll be part of it until I'm not, until I'm the one being buried while someone who loves me stands by a grave trying to make sense of a senseless world. When that day comes, I hope Maria doesn't linger too long at the cemetery. Not because I fear for her safety anymore. Those 3 men, and the message their death sent, probably bought her lifetime immunity from opportunistic predators. But because cemeteries are places of ending, and I'd rather she remember me from life than death, remember the brother who protected her rather than the killer who existed in service of that protection. That's probably too much to hope for, too much complexity to expect from memory and grief. But it's what I hope for anyway, in whatever capacity men like me are allowed to hope. I'm now 60 years old, and the world I knew has almost completely disappeared. The 5 families that once ruled New York with iron discipline are shells of their former selves, reduced to small crews running protection rackets and minor scams, while the feds pick off members one by one. Most of the men I came up with are dead or in prison serving sentences that will outlive them. The boss I served under for 20 years died of natural causes 3 years ago, and his replacement is a businessman more than a gangster, someone who understands spreadsheets better than he understands the street. I've been semi-retired for the past 2 years. Officially stepped back from day-to-day operations, though everyone knows I'm still consulted on major decisions and that my word still carries weight in certain circles. Maria is now 55, her hair showing grey that she doesn't bother to dye, lines around her eyes that speak of years spent smiling at children in her classroom and crying alone at night for a husband who's been gone a decade. She never remarried, though I know she had opportunities. Sometimes, I wonder if what happened at Vincent's grave created a fear in her that prevented her from opening herself to someone new, if the violence that I thought would protect her actually damaged something fundamental. It's a question I can't ask, and she wouldn't answer honestly even if I did. We see each other monthly now for dinner, maintaining the ritual we established, and the conversation has become easier as we've aged, as if time has softened the sharp edges of what separates our worlds. Last month, Maria told me something that shook me in ways I didn't expect. She'd been going through some of Vincent's old papers, documents she'd kept in boxes in her closet for all these years, and she'd found a journal he'd kept during the last year of his life. She read it, she told me, and discovered that Vincent had known more about my life than she'd realized, that he'd understood who I was and what I did, despite her efforts to keep those worlds separate. He'd written about his concerns, about whether it was fair to Maria to keep her connected even tangentially to my world through family bonds, about whether her safety was truly guaranteed, or just an illusion built on my reputation. But he'd also written about respect, about how he understood that I'd protected Maria her whole life, that the peaceful existence she enjoyed was possible only because I'd made it so. He'd written that, if anything ever happened to him, he trusted that I'd continue that protection, and that Maria was lucky to have a brother who loved her enough to do terrible things so that she never had to. Reading these entries that Maria shared with me, sitting at that same kitchen table where we'd sat so many times over so many years, I felt something I rarely feel, validation from a source that mattered. Vincent had understood, perhaps better than Maria herself did, the complexity of what I was and what I did. He'd seen past the violence to the purpose underneath, and he'd been grateful for it, even while wishing it wasn't necessary. It was absolution I didn't know I needed until I received it. The 3 men who died in that warehouse 6 years ago have been completely forgotten by everyone except me and the handful of men who were there that night. Their names don't appear in any memorial. No one seeks justice for them. No cold case detectives lie awake wondering what happened. They've been erased from history as thoroughly as if they'd never existed, which was the point, but which also carries its own weight. I think about them sometimes, particularly Derek Morrison with his scar and his pathetic attempts at bravado, and I wonder what chain of decisions and circumstances led him to that cemetery on that afternoon. He'd probably grown up poor, probably had a father who beat him or abandoned him, probably never had a legitimate opportunity that didn't require education or skills he'd never been given the chance to develop. That doesn't excuse what he did to Maria, doesn't make me regret the decision I made, but it complicates it in ways that have grown more pronounced as I've aged. When you're younger, violence comes easier, certainty comes easier. The world divides more cleanly into those who deserve protection and those who deserve elimination. As you get older, if you're capable of any reflection at all, you start to see the systems and circumstances that create people like Derek Morrison, and you wonder if there's some collective guilt we all share for allowing those systems to persist. Then again, maybe that's just the sentimentality of old age, the luxury of philosophical consideration that comes when you're no longer in the arena making split-second decisions about survival and loyalty. I've been visited by FBI agents 4 times in the past 2 years, Always the same two men, Agent Martinez and Agent Chen, both young enough to be my sons, both convinced they're going to be the ones who finally build a RICO case that puts me away for life. They have surveillance photos and wiretap transcripts and testimony from informants, but nothing that quite connects, nothing that builds into a narrative a jury would believe beyond reasonable doubt. They know what I am and what I've done, but knowing and proving remain frustratingly different things from their perspective. During our last meeting, Agent Martinez, the more talkative of the two, asked me directly about the three men who disappeared 6 years ago. He said they knew I'd been involved, that they had testimony placing me in the area that night, that they'd connected me to the warehouse where they believed the murders had occurred. I looked at him across the table in the federal building downtown, this earnest young man who believed justice meant putting old gangsters in prison, and I asked him if he had any evidence beyond belief. He admitted they didn't, not yet, but he promised they'd keep looking, that eventually someone would talk or some physical evidence would surface. I told him he was wasting his time on a case about 3 lowlifes who'd probably skipped town to avoid debts, and that he should focus his energy on crimes that actually mattered to communities. He said that all victims matter, that even criminals deserve justice. I almost laughed at the innocence of that statement, at the faith in systems that I'd spent my whole life navigating around. But I kept my face neutral and told him I had nothing more to say, which has been my position for 40 years and will remain my position until I'm dead. Maria's school held a ceremony last spring honouring her 30 years as a teacher, and she invited me to attend. I almost declined, uncomfortable with being in a room full of children and their parents, people whose lives were so far removed from mine that we might as well be different species. But she insisted, said it would mean a lot to her, so I went. I sat in the back of the auditorium in a suit that probably cost more than most of the parents earned in a month, watching my sister receive a plaque and listening to testimonials from former students who talked about how she'd changed their lives, how she'd believed in them when no one else did, how her classroom had been a place of safety and encouragement. One student, now a young woman in college, broke down crying while describing how Maria had noticed signs of abuse at home and had intervened, connecting the family with social services and ensuring the child was protected. Listening to this, I felt a complicated mixture of pride and something like shame. My sister had spent her life protecting children through patience and compassion and working within systems, while I'd spent mine protecting people through violence and fear and operating entirely outside those systems. We'd both been protectors in our own ways, but her methods built people up while mine tore them down. There was no question which approach was more admirable, more sustainable, more aligned with any reasonable moral framework. And yet, I also knew that her ability to do her work in peace, to go to that school every day without fear, was guaranteed at least in part by my reputation, by the fact that people knew she was Michael Torino's sister, and that harming her would bring consequences beyond law. After the ceremony, Maria introduced me to some of her colleagues, other teachers who shook my hand and made small talk about how proud I must be. I played the role of supportive older brother, asked appropriate questions about curriculum and educational policy, laughed at jokes about standardized testing. All the while, I was aware of being a predator in a gathering of civilians, of carrying violence in my history and potentially in my future that would horrify these gentle people if they knew. There's a loneliness in that, in being someone who has to constantly monitor what he says and how he presents himself, who can never fully relax into authenticity, because authenticity would reveal things that would end relationships and possibly freedom. I've lived with that loneliness for so long it's become part of my baseline existence, but sometimes in moments like that ceremony, surrounded by normalcy and goodness, it becomes acute and almost unbearable. I wanted to be just Maria's brother, just a man proud of his sister's accomplishments, but I was also and always Michael Torino, underboss, killer, a man whose presence carried implications that extended far beyond whatever role I was trying to perform in that moment. When I finally left the school that afternoon, I felt relief mixed with melancholy, grateful to escape the performance, but also mourning what I'd never be able to fully experience because of choices made decades ago that couldn't be unmade. The neighborhood where Maria lives has changed dramatically over the past decade. Gentrification transforming working-class Italian and Irish blocks into expensive real estate for young professionals. The old social clubs, where men like me used to gather, are closed or converted into hipster coffee shops. The bakeries that made bread the way our grandmothers taught them have been replaced by organic juice bars and vegan restaurants. Maria's building is one of the few that hasn't been converted to luxury condos, held in rent-stabilized status through a combination of luck and legal protections. She loves her apartment despite its dated fixtures and creaky floors, loves it because it's where she built a life with Vincent and where his memory still resides in every room. I've offered multiple times to buy her something nicer, somewhere with better security and modern amenities, but she always refuses. She doesn't want my money, doesn't want to owe me beyond what she already owes, doesn't want her life to be improved through resources generated by activities she'd rather not think about. I respect that boundary even though part of me wishes she'd let me help her more concretely. Let me use the only thing I have in abundance, money earned through crime, to improve her material circumstances. But Maria has always had a stronger moral compass than me, a clearer sense of what she can accept and what would compromise her too much. It's one of the things I admire most about her, that integrity that I lost somewhere around age 16 and never recovered. I've started writing this all down, this account of my life, and particularly of what happened at that cemetery, because I've been diagnosed with lung cancer. Stage 4, metastasized, the kind where doctors talk about months rather than years. I've smoked since I was 14, 2 packs a day for most of my adult life, so I can't claim surprise. The irony of surviving 4 decades in organized crime, avoiding prison and assassination and informant testimony, only to be killed by cigarettes, isn't lost on me. Maria doesn't know yet about the diagnosis. I'm planning to tell her soon, but I wanted to get this down first, wanted to create a record of my perspective before pain or medication or death clouds my ability to think clearly. I don't know what she'll do with this account, whether she'll read it or destroy it immediately, whether it will provide any comfort or understanding, or whether it will just be one more burden I've placed on her. But I need her to know how I saw things, how every decision I made regarding her was driven by love, even when it was executed through violence. I need her to understand that the 3 men who attacked her at Vincent's grave weren't just random criminals I eliminated. They were violators of something sacred, who gave me opportunity to be what I'd always wanted to be for her. Absolute protector, the brother who ensured that nothing and no one could hurt her without facing consequences that transcended law and society. Whether that makes me hero or monster or something too complicated for either category is for her to decide. I just need her to know that it came from love, twisted and expressed through brutality perhaps, but love nonetheless. The FBI agent stopped visiting about 6 months ago, which either means they've given up on building a case against me or they're preparing something big. I'd guess the former, given that I'm a dying man and prosecuting me now would cost resources for minimal return. Most of the people I'd testify against are already dead or imprisoned, and the organizational knowledge I possess is about structures that barely exist anymore. I've become irrelevant to both the criminal world I was part of and the law enforcement apparatus that pursued me, rendered obsolete by age and illness and the simple passage of time. There's something almost peaceful about that irrelevance, about no longer being important enough to fear or chase. I can sit in my apartment and look out at the city and smoke cigarettes that are killing me without worrying about surveillance or betrayal or the 100 other concerns that dominated my adult life. I can think about Maria and Vincent and the 3 men in the warehouse and all the other moments of violence and protection that defined my existence, and I can try to make sense of what it all meant. whether it added up to anything beyond survival and loyalty, whether I can claim to have loved well, even if I've lived badly. These are the kind of questions you have time for when you're dying, when the urgent demands of maintaining power and avoiding prosecution fade into irrelevance against the ultimate deadline. I don't expect to find answers, but asking the questions feels important somehow, feels like the minimum requirement for examined life, even one as morally compromised as mine. I met with Paulie Romano last week at the old social club that somehow survives in Little Italy despite gentrification, one of the few places where men like us can still gather without feeling like museum pieces. Paulie is 64 now, officially retired, living on pension from union job he held as cover for 40 years and on savings accumulated through careful management of his criminal earnings. We drank espresso and played cards and talked about old times in the way that old men do, remembering people and events that seem impossibly distant now. I told him about the cancer, and I saw something shift in his face, that recognition of mortality that comes when someone your own age gets handed a death sentence. He asked what he could do, and I told him there was nothing, that this was one problem we couldn't solve with violence or money or connections. But I also told him about this account I'm writing, and I asked him if he'd make sure Maria got it after I was gone, if he'd be the intermediary who delivered it so she didn't have to receive it directly from my lawyer or executor. He agreed without hesitation, and I knew he would. Paulie has been loyal for over 40 years, through situations that would have broken lesser men, and that loyalty will extend past my death into whatever matters I leave unfinished. We talked about the cemetery incident, something we hadn't discussed in years, and Paulie told me he'd always thought that was my finest moment, the time when everything I was supposed to be about, all the codes and values we claim to uphold, actually meant something concrete and visible. I'm not sure I agree with that assessment, but I appreciate that he saw it that way, that someone I respect saw nobility in what might have just been naked revenge dressed up in rationalization. Maria called me yesterday to invite me to dinner this weekend, our regular monthly ritual that has persisted through everything. I said yes, as I always do, and I decided that this dinner would be when I tell her about the cancer. She deserves to know, deserves to have whatever time remains to prepare for my death, to say whatever she needs to say, to make peace with or rage against how our story ends. I'm not particularly afraid of dying. I've lived with the possibility of violent death for so long that the certainty of medical death seems almost anticlimactic. What I fear is Maria's pain, adding more grief to a life that's already held too much of it. She lost Vincent at 42, lost our parents years before that, and now she'll lose me, the complicated brother who protected her and burdened her in equal measure. I wish I could spare her that, wish I could simply disappear the way those 3 men disappeared, vanishing without ceremony or prolonged suffering. But death from cancer doesn't work that way. There will be deterioration and hospitals, and the gradual stripping away of dignity that terminal illness brings. She'll watch me diminish, and there's nothing I can do to prevent that. All I can do is try to die as well as possible, with whatever grace and courage I can muster, showing her that even men like me can face the end with some form of dignity. It's the last thing I'll be able to give her, this performance of strength in weakness, this demonstration that the brother who protected her remains unbroken even as his body fails. The cemetery where Vincent is buried has become something like a second home for Maria over the years. She visits every Sunday morning without fail, brings fresh flowers, tends the grave, sits on the bench nearby, and reads or simply thinks. I've arranged for private security to monitor the cemetery, never intrusive but always present, ensuring that what happened 6 years ago can never happen again. Maria doesn't know about this security, would probably object if she did, but it's non-negotiable for me. As long as I'm alive and have resources to deploy, she'll be protected whether she wants to be or not. After I'm gone, I've set up a trust that will continue funding this security indefinitely, ensuring that my protection extends beyond my death. It's perhaps the most concrete expression of love I'm capable of, this arrangement that treats her safety as highest priority, regardless of cost or her own preferences about it. I imagine I'll eventually be buried in the same cemetery, probably not far from Vincent, and Maria will have two graves to visit, two men who loved her in very different ways. I wonder if she'll speak to my grave the way I've seen her speak to Vincent's, if she'll share her thoughts and concerns with my marker the way widows do with their husbands. Or will my grave remain more silent, visited out of obligation rather than the desire for continued connection? I suppose I won't know, and in death, that kind of knowledge becomes irrelevant. But sitting here in my apartment, still alive, still capable of caring about such things, it matters to me how I'll be remembered by the one person whose opinion has always mattered most. This account has become longer than I intended, sprawling beyond the simple narrative of the cemetery incident into something more like confession or memoir. Maybe that's appropriate for a man facing death, this need to leave a complete record, to explain myself fully before explanation becomes impossible. I started by describing what happened to those three men, justice or revenge or whatever you want to call it. But I've ended up describing my whole relationship with Maria, the weight of being her protector, the complicated love between siblings whose lives took such divergent paths. If there's a point to all this, it's probably that violence, even violence done for good reasons by people who love each other, is always more complicated than it appears. Those three men died because they attacked my sister, yes. But they also died because I live in a world where that kind of response is not only possible but expected, where failure to respond would have been its own kind of violation. They died because of who I am and what I've chosen to become, choices that stretch back decades before Maria ever knelt at Vincent's grave. In a sense, their deaths were inevitable from the moment I joined my uncle's crew at 15, setting in motion a life trajectory that would make me the kind of man who kills to protect family. Recognizing that doesn't absolve me of responsibility, but it does complicate the simple narrative of righteous vengeance. Everything is more complicated than it appears, especially in the moral realm. And I guess I want Maria to understand that complexity, to see me not as simply good or evil, but as human in all the contradictory messiness that entails. I'll end this account with something I've never told Maria directly, something I hope she'll understand when she reads this after I'm gone. Despite everything, despite the violence and the moral compromises and the life lived outside law and conventional morality, I'm grateful for the opportunity to have been her brother. Protecting her has given my life a meaning and purpose that it wouldn't have had otherwise. In a life full of ugliness and brutality, she's been the one beautiful thing, the reminder that goodness exists and is worth preserving even at terrible cost. What I did to those three men in that warehouse was horrible by any normal standard, but it was also the purest expression of love I'm capable of, the thing I could do that no one else could or would do, using the skills and connections I've developed through a criminal life to serve the one purely good relationship in my existence. If I could go back and choose differently, choose a legitimate life that never developed those skills or connections, I'd still be useless to her when she needed protection. The brother who could have lived cleanly wouldn't have been able to help her that day at the cemetery. So, I don't regret who I became, even knowing the cost to my soul and conscience, because who I became was what she needed me to be in that moment. That's what family means, or what it's meant to me. Being willing to damn yourself so that those you love can remain untouched by damnation. Maria, if you're reading this, know that I loved you with whatever capacity for love a man like me retains. You were the best of us, and protecting you was the best of me. I'm sorry for the burden of being my sister, but I'm not sorry for anything I did in service of keeping you safe. That's the closest thing to moral clarity I've ever achieved, and it will have to be enough.